The transatlantic slave trade began in 1441 when Prince Henry the Navigator requested slaves from the African coast. Prince Henry created a large slave market in Portugal. By the year 1552, African slaves made up 10% of the population of Lisbon. Following the creation of a significant population of slaves in Portugal, the Crown in Portugal gave up their monopoly on the slave trade and moved their attentions to colonies in America. The Portuguese finally settled on Brazil. Their control over Brazil was formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas was granted by Pope Alexander VI that justified Spain's claims to most of the New World and justified Portugal's claims to much of the Old World and a portion of the New World that included Brazil. Portuguese slave owners in Brazil created large sugar plantations to make profits from their slaves. Approximately 11,863,000 Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, with the death rate during the Middle Passage reducing this number by 10 to 20%. As a result, between 9.6 and 10.8 million Africans arrived in the Americas. With the discovery of the Americas, European powers now had new land and people that they could easily take advantage of. What they lacked now for turning these new colonies into agricultural powerhouses was a labor source. Native Americans were dying off quickly due to disease and warfare with the newly arrived Europeans, so they were unreliable as a source for labor. The solution to these labor problems was the arrival of African slaves brought from its west coast to the Caribbean. Sold into slavery by rival tribes and those who conquered them, these slaves proved excellent for working in the Caribbean due to their previous exposure to European diseases and training done by breaking in camps, where they learned to speak English or Spanish and were taught to obey their white masters. Sugar had previously been introduced to the Europeans from East Asia, but its growing requirements did not align with those the Mediterranean could meet. Because of this, sugar largely remained a luxurious spice to Europeans, but it had a new hope in the form of Brazil, where the Portuguese were able to grow sugarcane there and bring it to the Caribbean. The intensive sugar growing process requires speed, strength, and stamina in the tropical climate that neither whites nor Native Americans could supply. Without the option to enslave the Native Americans, and with white indentured servants being ill-suited for the job, the only alternative was black slaves provided by the triangle trade. With this new labor source, producing sugar became a profitable endeavor that could coexist with cotton and tobacco plantations existing in North American colonies. The island of Saint Domingue, now Haiti, became the dominant island of the Caribbean by the mid-18th century. 600 ships came annually to the island, taking its sugar, coffee, cotton, indigo, and cacao to Europe. Boasting almost 500,000 slaves, it quickly became the world's largest producer of sugar and rapidly advanced towards that title for coffee. The triangle trade made all of this possible, with the tropical labor requirements and the slaves that could meet them rocketing the Caribbean into the forefront of Western trade. In 1621, the first black slave was brought to America. That slave was Anthony Johnson. Johnson was brought to America on the slave ship James. These slaves were bought by American colonists. Historians believe that the early African slaves were treated as indentured servants rather than as chattel slaves. This is apparent when one examines the fact that early slaves were freed after a given number of years and later went on to own slaves themselves. John Rolfe, the man who discovered the success of Spanish tobacco in Virginia, found a way to make the colony of Virginia prosperous. In Europe, and especially in England, tobacco smoking had caught on as a fashionable habit. This created a much larger market for the production of tobacco. With the growing success of tobacco, slave owners began to establish large slave plantations to make a profit off of their enslaved African laborers. Slaves despised their mistreatment and rebelled in any way they could. These methods of protest included murdering their owners, sabotaging crops, animals, and tools, deliberately working at a leisurely pace, committing suicide, and running away. They also outright rebelled. In Stono, South Carolina, in 1739, 20 slaves rebelled and killed 2 warehouse guards. After looting the warehouse for guns and gunpowder, they headed south, and others joined them on their way. In response to the growing threat of slave revolt in the South, slave codes were passed to further oppress the slaves and prevent slave uprisings before they came to be. These slave codes stated that slaves were not allowed to travel without the written permission of their master and could not congregate in large numbers in the presence of whites. The slave codes also dictated that for major crimes such as murder and rape, slaves were to be hanged. For minor offenses, slaves were to be whipped, maimed, or branded. Tobacco did not flourish in the Deep South like it had in the Chesapeake Bay region. However, rice and indigo plantations thrived in the Deep South. Large-scale plantation agriculture continued to be used in the South throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s. Slaves were the labor inputs on southern plantations, and their labor is what made the South the economic powerhouse that it was before the Civil War. Slavery in Africa was a much milder institution than that which prevailed in America. Slaves were not required as fuel to an economic powerhouse like a kingdom or empire, but were rather an everyday servant to the desires of a family. An issue faced European, predominantly Portuguese, traders as they attempted to fill their ships with as much cargo as possible to supply a growing demand in the West. Africans seeking good-paying jobs took part in the movement of millions of future slaves to the West Coast. Upon arrival, the enslavees would now have to wait weeks or months in slave factories. A factory was a European company's coastal trading post, where merchants conducted the business of trading for slaves. In exchange for the delivery of the slaves to the African West Coast, European traders would offer luxury customer goods as well as guns, which was a good trade as the guns could be used to corral more slaves. This transaction took particular interest in 1727 in the Kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, where a slave trading operation opened and became, according to Duncan Rice, one of the greatest slaving machines on the coast. That company would bloom to serve up to 20% of the total slave trade. The process of preparing slaves for the voyage was above all else the black eye of the operation. In order to prepare slaves for the voyage, they had to be graded on height, muscle definition, age, gender, etc., branded in accordance with the slave trading company involved or the intended destination for the slave, and finally crammed into ships at maximum capacity. Slavery in the Americas was a gruesome practice. One of the most gruesome aspects of American slavery was the transatlantic voyage that the slaves had to make. Purchased slaves were immediately fastened together 2 by 2 by handcuffs and irons on their legs. Men, women, and children were separated into different compartments. They were laid so close to each other that everyone had to lie on their sides. Every morning, the slaves were brought to the top of the deck to be examined. Their chains would be heavily monitored to prevent any of them diving overboard. If the weather was fine, then the slaves would be allowed to stay in the open air until late afternoon. The slaves were fed twice a day, once in the early morning and again at around 4 in the afternoon. They were fed by their own terms, which means, inevitably, there were numerous conflicts and fights. Water was only given half a pint at a time to each slave. If slaves refused to eat, then hot coals would be placed close enough to their lips to burn them. They would be threatened. One captain poured hot, melted lead onto one of the slaves that continuously refused to eat. Generally, these harsh punishments were enough to break even the most rebellious slaves. Exercise was highly stressed on slave ships. Captains would force slaves to dance, and if they weren't fast enough, then they would be whipped. Sometimes they were cruelly forced to sing. Their songs consisted mostly of melancholy, sad, reminiscent memories. The treatment of women was considerably worse. Many females were raped by the white men on board, who justified their actions by claiming consent from the victim. So many women jumped overboard following the trauma, as white crewmen were allowed to copulate at will. Perhaps the most difficult task slaves had to overcome was the lack of fresh air. Whenever there was rain or bad weather, all the portholes were closed. This caused the air to become incredibly hot and humid. In addition, the mucus and blood on the ground resembled that of a slaughterhouse. The smell in the compartments was so atrocious that, combined with the overwhelming heat, it was enough to cause many slaves to faint and die.